He booked our anniversary dinner at Boston's most exclusive restaurant, requesting a table for four instead of two, one seat for him, one for my former best friend who he'd been sleeping with for months, one for his divorce attorney, and one for me to watch his world crumble. When he smugly told me I'd never be able to afford a place like this after our divorce, I smiled and stood up. "Will," I said, loud enough for the entire dining room to hear, "meet my staff." As FBI agents entered with handcuffs, I delivered the final blow. "Oh, and darling, get out of my restaurant." I'm sitting at table 15 in the Sapphire, watching my husband's face transform from arrogance to horror as he realizes the magnitude of his miscalculation. If this story of revenge and redemption resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow we've saved something extraordinary for you. Hit that like button and tell us in the comments, what would you have done in my position? I'm sitting at table 15 in the Sapphire, Boston's most exclusive restaurant, watching my husband of 7 years hold hands with my former best friend. The crystal flute of Dom Perignon 2010 trembles slightly in my fingers, the same vintage Will and I shared on our wedding night. Tonight isn't a celebration. Tonight is an execution. Across the dining room, William Reynolds makes his entrance with all the swagger of a man who believes he holds all the cards. At 36, he's maintained his college athlete physique, his sandy hair perfectly styled, wearing a Tom Ford suit that costs more than most people's monthly salary. His arm is wrapped possessively around Sophia Miller's waist. Sophia, my former best friend and maid of honor, is stunning in a red Valentino dress that hugs every curve. Her auburn hair falls in perfect waves, and she carries herself with the predatory grace of a woman who has stolen another woman's life and feels no shame about it. They're followed by Gregory Palmer, Will's high-powered divorce attorney, a shark in an Armani suit who specializes in destroying wealthy wives and leaving them with nothing. The three of them move through the restaurant like conquerors. Will nods to acquaintances. Sophia clings to his arm like a trophy, and Greg surveys the room with the cold calculation of a predator assessing territory. As they settle at table 12, the very table I had reserved for our 7th anniversary dinner, Will catches sight of me, and his expression shifts to one of cruel satisfaction. This wasn't an accident or a coincidence. This was psychological warfare, meticulously planned to inflict maximum humiliation. I received his text 3 hours earlier. "Change of plans for tonight, taking Sophia to the Sapphire instead. Don't wait up. Greg will be joining us to discuss our future arrangements. Hope you understand." Darling. The audacity was breathtaking. Not only was he flaunting his affair with my former best friend on our anniversary, but he was conducting divorce strategy sessions in public, treating our 7-year marriage like a business transaction to be dissolved. As Will orders the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu, a 1982 Chateau Latour that costs $9,000, he begins holding court at his table. His voice carries across the dining room as he regales Sophia and Greg with stories of his upcoming senatorial campaign, his real estate investments, his vision for their post-divorce future. "After the divorce is finalized," he announces, cutting into a Wagyu steak that costs more than some people's weekly salary. Sophia and I are thinking of opening our own restaurant, something tasteful, exclusive, not like those little neighborhood cafes Elizabeth always talks about opening someday. Sophia laughs, a tinkling sound that once brought me comfort during late-night phone calls about Will's neglect, and now sounds like breaking glass. "Oh, Will, you're terrible," she purrs, but her eyes gleam with malicious delight. "Though I do think we'd be fabulous restaurant owners. We have such exquisite taste." Greg nods approvingly, already calculating billable hours. "The prenup is ironclad," he assures them. "She'll get the minimum required by law. The house, the investments, the business contacts, it all stays with Will. She'll be lucky to afford a studio apartment in Dorchester when this is over." What none of them realize is that every word is being heard not just by me, but by Diana Chen, the Sapphire's head sommelier, who stands frozen beside their table with the wine they've ordered. Diana's eyes meet mine across the room, and a look of understanding passes between us. Diana has been with the Sapphire since its opening 3 years ago. She knows exactly who signs her paychecks. I take a final sip of my champagne and place the glass on the marble table with deliberate precision. I smooth my navy silk dress, check my reflection in the window that overlooks Boston Harbor, and begin the walk across the dining room that will change everything. My heels click against the marble floor with the rhythm of a countdown, each step bringing me closer to the moment when Will's carefully constructed world will collapse around him. As I approach table 12, conversations at nearby tables begin to quiet. There's something in my bearing, a quiet authority, a sense of impending reckoning that makes people take notice. Will, still oblivious to the approaching storm, continues his performance for Sophia and Greg. unaware that his wife is about to serve him the most expensive meal of his life. The stage is set, the players are in position, and I'm about to remind everyone in the room that in the game of revenge, the house always wins. Especially when you own the house. I wasn't born into wealth, though my current life might suggest otherwise. 3 years ago, I was working 16-hour days as a line cook at a struggling bistro in Cambridge. My culinary degree from the Institute of Culinary Education barely covered the rent on my cramped studio apartment. I had dreams that stretched far beyond the smoke-filled kitchen where I spent my days perfecting sauces and plating dishes that would never earn me recognition. What Will never knew, what no one knew except the small circle of investors and legal advisors who helped me build my empire, was that I had inherited more than just my grandmother's recipe collection when Eleanor Mitchell passed away 2 years into my marriage. Hidden in her effects was a safety deposit box key and a letter that would change everything. Inside that box were bearer bonds worth $2. 5 million money Eleanor had quietly accumulated over decades of smart investments. Money she'd kept secret from everyone, including her own family. The letter was simple: Elizabeth, you're the only one who inherited my business sense, along with my love of cooking. Build something that matters. Make it yours completely. Trust no one with this secret until you're ready to wield the power it gives you. The Sapphire hadn't been the Sapphire when I first found it. It was Le Petit Bistrot, a failing French restaurant in Boston's Back Bay with a prime location. Beautiful bones, and an owner drowning in debt. The previous owner, Chef Michel Dubois, was on the verge of bankruptcy, his dream crumbling under poor management and even worse financial decisions. I approached him through a shell company, Mitchell Hospitality Group, with an offer he couldn't refuse. I would purchase the restaurant, renovate it completely, and rebrand it as the Sapphire. Michelle could stay on as head chef with a generous salary and full creative control over the menu, but I would own everything. The paperwork was designed to obscure my identity to anyone looking from the outside. Mitchell Hospitality Group appeared to be owned by a consortium of anonymous investors. The renovation took 8 months and cost another $1.8 million. I oversaw every detail personally, from the imported Italian marble floors to the custom-designed crystal chandeliers. I hired the best Diana Chen from Le Bernardin as head sommelier, Robert Martinez as general manager from Daniel, Mark Thompson as executive sous chef from 11 Madison Park. I paid them well enough to ensure their loyalty and discretion. During the day, I transformed myself into the perfect political wife. I attended Will's campaign events, smiled for photographs, and played the role of the supportive spouse, building his career in real estate development and state politics. I managed our Beacon Hill townhouse, entertained his business associates, and never once let slip that I had built something extraordinary while he was busy climbing his own ladder of ambition. Will believed my inheritance from Eleanor had been modest, maybe $50,000 that went toward paying off my student loans. He never questioned where I spent my days when I said I was exploring my options or taking some time to figure out my next career move. He was too focused on his own pursuits to notice that his wife had quietly become one of the most successful restaurateurs in Boston. The irony wasn't lost on me that Will often complained about our inability to get reservations at exclusive restaurants. It's all about connections, he would say dismissively. When I'm elected to state senate, we'll have access to places like the Sapphire. Right now, we're just not important enough. I would nod sympathetically, all while knowing that with a single phone call, I could secure any table in my restaurant at any time. But maintaining the secret had become part of the strategy. Let him believe he was the one with power and connections. Let him think I was dependent on him for access to the world I wanted to inhabit. What Will also didn't realize was that I had built more than just a restaurant. The Sapphire had become a gathering place for Boston's power brokers, and I had cultivated relationships with every one of them. The governor dined here monthly. Federal judges celebrated anniversaries at Table 7. Media moguls sealed deals over my chef's tasting menu. I knew their preferences, their secrets, their weaknesses. Information flowed to me like wine flows to a sommelier naturally, abundantly, and with perfect timing. When Senator Patricia Hayes needed a discreet venue for sensitive political discussions, she called me. When tech billionaire David Chen wanted to propose to his longtime partner away from paparazzi, the Sapphire's private dining room provided the perfect sanctuary. I never asked for favors in return. I simply provided impeccable service, absolute discretion, and an atmosphere where powerful people felt comfortable being themselves. But I remembered everything every conversation overheard, every alliance formed over appetizers, every betrayal discussed over dessert. 6 months ago, when Will first started coming home with Sophia's perfume on his clothes, I had briefly considered confronting him immediately. I could have hired a private investigator, gathered evidence, and filed for divorce with the full force of my hidden wealth behind me, But then I realized something far more delicious. Will was planning to destroy me, using my own restaurant as the venue for his victory lap. The audacity was breathtaking, but it was also the perfect gift. He was handing me the opportunity to expose his betrayal in the most public, most humiliating way possible in front of the very people whose respect and connections he desperately craved. Tonight wasn't just our anniversary. It was opening night for the most spectacular show the Sapphire had ever hosted, and William Reynolds was about to discover that he'd unwittingly bought himself a front row seat to his own destruction. As I continued my measured walk across the marble floor toward table 12, I caught Diana's eye and gave the slightest nod. Phase 1 was about to begin. The text message had arrived at exactly 3:47 p.m. while I was reviewing quarterly financial reports in my home office. Will thought I was looking at freelance catering opportunities, another one of my carefully constructed lies. In reality, I was analyzing the Sapphire's profit margins, which had exceeded projections by 18% in the third quarter alone. Change of plans for tonight, taking Sophia to the Sapphire instead. Don't wait up. Greg will be joining us to discuss our future arrangements. Hope you understand. Darling? I stared at those words for a full minute, my coffee growing cold in the Hermes mug Will had given me for our last anniversary. The casual cruelty was breathtaking, not just the affair I'd suspected that for months, but the calculated timing, the choice of venue, the inclusion of his divorce attorney. He was conducting psychological warfare disguised as a dinner reservation. What made it even more devastating was the choice of Sophia. We'd been inseparable since college, bonding over late-night study sessions and shared dreams of conquering Boston. She'd been my maid of honor, the first person I called when Will proposed, the shoulder I cried on when our marriage started showing cracks. The betrayal cut deeper than any affair with a stranger ever could. But there was something else in that message that Will couldn't have known would be the fatal flaw in his plan. The Sapphire, my restaurant, the empire I'd built in secret while he patronized me about my little cooking dreams. He'd chosen to destroy our marriage in the very place where I held all the power, and he had no idea. I sat down my coffee and reached for my personal phone, not the one Will occasionally check, but the encrypted device I used for all Sapphire business. 3 quick calls would set everything in motion. Diana, it's me. I need you to personally handle table 12 tonight. My husband will be dining there with 2 guests. Full VIP treatment, but I want you to observe everything and report back. Robert, clear table 15 for tonight. I'll be dining alone, but position it with a clear view of 12. Standard service, nothing that draws attention. Mark, I need you to prepare something special for dessert, something that will make an impression. We're hosting a very important performance tonight. Each person I spoke with understood immediately. They'd been with me since the beginning, had seen me build the Sapphire from the ruins of Le Petit Bistrot. More importantly, they'd become protective of what we created together. When I explained that my husband was planning to humiliate me in my own restaurant, their responses were swift and certain. Whatever you need, Diana said, her voice carrying the steel that made her one of the most respected sommeliers in the city. Consider it done, Robert replied, already mentally rearranging the evening's seating chart. This is going to be legendary, Mark added with dark satisfaction. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of preparation. I showered and dressed with the care of a general preparing for battle. The navy silk dress wasn't chosen randomly. It was Will's favorite, the one I wore to his campaign launch party, where he proudly introduced me as his secret weapon. Tonight, he was about to discover just how accurate that description was. I arrived at the Sapphire at 7:30, 90 minutes before Will's reservation. The staff who knew my true identity greeted me with subtle nods, while those who didn't simply saw another elegantly dressed patron. I took my position at table 15, ordered the Dom Perignon that Will and I had shared on our wedding night, and settled in to wait. At 8:45, I watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows as a black town car pulled up outside. Will emerged first, checking his reflection in the window before helping Sophia out of the vehicle. She was stunning in red Valentino, probably purchased with money from our joint account that Will controlled. Behind them, Greg Brooks unfolded his considerable height from the car, straightening his Armani suit with the casual arrogance of a man who made his living destroying lives. The maitre d' Robert greeted them with perfect professionalism, though I caught the slight tightening around his eyes as Will made a show of dropping my name. My wife tried to get a reservation here for months, he said, loudly enough for nearby patrons to hear. Lucky for us, I have better connections. They were seated at table 12 with great ceremony, Will clearly enjoying what he believed was his moment of triumph. I watched as Diana approached with the wine list, her expression perfectly neutral as Will made a great show of ordering the most expensive bottle available, the 1982 Chateau Latour was nearly $9,000 more than many people made in a month. Sophia played her part perfectly, gasping at the opulence, touching Will's arm with practiced intimacy, casting occasional glances around the dining room to see who was watching their performance. She wore my former friendship like an accessory, something to make her conquest of my life more complete. But it was Greg's presence that revealed the true scope of Will's calculation. This wasn't just infidelity, it was a complete dismantling of our marriage, disguised as a romantic dinner. I could see him occasionally pulling out his phone, taking notes, probably documenting my absence for future custody and financial proceedings. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I overheard Will explaining to a neighboring table that he was treating his campaign manager to a celebration dinner. Campaign manager. So that's how he was publicly explaining Sophia's role in his life. It was brilliant. Really a perfectly legitimate reason for intimate dinners, weekend trips, and late night strategy sessions. As the evening progressed and Will grew more confident in his performance, his voice carried further across the dining room. He began regaling his companions with stories of our marriage, painting me as the struggling, dependent wife who would be lost without his support and connections. Each word was carefully chosen to establish a narrative for their divorce proceedings. Liz has such quaint ideas about opening a little neighborhood cafe someday, he said, cutting into his Wagyu steak. Sweet, really, but completely unrealistic. She has no head for business, no understanding of what it takes to succeed in this city. I took another sip of champagne and smiled. In approximately 15 minutes, William Reynolds was about to receive the most expensive education of his life. Watching Will perform for his audience while Sophia hung on his every word was like watching a masterclass in psychological cruelty. But what hurt most wasn't the affair itself. It was seeing my former best friend participate so willingly in my humiliation. Sophia knew things about me that Will had never bothered to learn. She knew about my childhood dreams of opening a restaurant, about the nights I stayed awake sketching menu ideas, about the cooking shows I watched religiously while Will dismissed them as background noise. She'd been there during our engagement when Will first started showing his true colors. I remembered calling her in tears after he'd casually mentioned that I should probably give up the cooking thing once we were married, since his political career would require a wife who could focus full time on supporting his ambitions. Sophia had held me while I cried, assured me that I deserved better, encouraged me to fight for my dreams. Now she was sitting at my table, in my restaurant, wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, playing the role of the sophisticated woman who understood Will's ambitions in ways his silly domestic wife never could. I watched her lean forward as Will explained his 5-year political plan, her eyes bright with the kind of attention I used to give his endless monologues about state senate politics and real estate development opportunities. She nodded at all the right moments, asked insightful questions about campaign strategy, made him feel like the brilliant, visionary leader he desperately wanted to be. The comparison was inevitable and painful. While Sophia appeared polished and professional in her designer dress and perfect makeup, I suddenly felt acutely aware of every flaw Will had ever pointed out about me. My hands, which he'd once called work-worn after I'd spent a weekend learning bread-making techniques. My hair, which he'd suggested I should style more professionally if I wanted to be taken seriously at his political events. My wardrobe, which he gradually influenced toward more conservative, wife-appropriate choices. For a moment, I was 27 again, standing in the bathroom of our first apartment, staring at my reflection after Will had helpfully suggested that I might want to lose a few pounds before his law firm's holiday party. I'd starved myself for 2 weeks, bought a dress I couldn't afford, and smiled until my face hurt while his colleagues' wives discussed their charity work and vacation homes in the Hamptons. The memories came flooding back 7 years of small compromises that had slowly eroded my sense of self. The cooking classes I'd stopped taking because they conflicted with his networking events. The job interviews I'd turned down because they would require evening or weekend work that might interfere with his social obligations. The friends I gradually lost touch with because Will found them too bohemian or not serious enough for our lifestyle. I'd convinced myself it was temporary that once Will's career was established, once we were financially secure, I could pursue my own dreams. But watching him with Sophia, I realized he'd never intended for that day to come. He'd systematically dismantled my independence while making me feel grateful for his guidance. Sophia had witnessed all of this. She'd been my confidant through every frustration, every moment of doubt, every time I'd questioned whether I was losing myself in my marriage. She'd encouraged me to stand up for my dreams, to demand more respect, to recognize my own worth. And now she was living the life she'd convinced me I deserved, while I sat alone watching them celebrate what they clearly saw as their victory. The worst part was how natural they looked together. Will was more animated than I'd seen him in years, his gestures more expansive, his laugh more genuine. Sophia brought out a side of him that I'd forgotten existed, the charming, ambitious man I'd fallen in love with in college. They shared inside jokes about campaign events I hadn't been invited to, discussed mutual acquaintances I'd never heard of, made plans for a future that didn't include me, for a brief, devastating moment. I wondered if they were right to be together, if Will had simply outgrown our marriage and found someone who better matched his evolving ambitions, if I was holding him back from becoming the man he was meant to be, if my dreams of opening a restaurant were really as naive and unrealistic as he'd always suggested. Greg's presence at the table added another layer of humiliation. This wasn't just a romantic dinner, it was a business meeting disguised as a celebration. I could see him occasionally taking notes on his phone, probably documenting my absence for future proceedings. They were planning my destruction while enjoying a $9,000 bottle of wine that Will would undoubtedly charge to our joint credit card. I thought about our early days together, when Will used to call me his secret weapon and brag about my cooking to anyone who would listen. He'd bring colleagues home for dinner just to show off my talents, claiming that a man is only as good as the woman behind him. Those dinners had made me feel valuable, important, like I was contributing to our shared success. But somewhere along the way, my cooking had become an expectation rather than a gift. Will started critiquing my menus, suggesting modifications based on his colleagues' dietary preferences, treating our dinner parties like political events that required strategic planning rather than creative expression. My passion had become another tool in his arsenal, and when it stopped serving his purposes, he'd begun systematically devaluing it. The champagne tasted bitter as I watched Sophia reach across the table to touch Will's hand. It was a gesture I'd made countless times in this exact same scenario, the supportive touch, the encouraging smile, the silent communication that said, "You're brilliant, and I believe in you." Except when I'd done it, Will had barely noticed. With Sophia, he immediately turned his palm up to capture her fingers, bringing her hand to his lips for a kiss that made several nearby diners smile at what they assumed was young love. I finished my champagne and signaled for another glass. In 10 minutes, I was going to walk across this dining room and remind William Reynolds exactly who he'd chosen to betray. But first, I needed to let myself feel the full weight of what I was losing, not just a marriage, but the version of myself I'd been trying to become for him, and the friend I'd trusted with my deepest vulnerabilities. The moment that changed everything wasn't Will's betrayal or even Sophia's participation in my humiliation. It was when I saw Greg Palmer pull out a manila folder and spread documents across the white tablecloth of Table 12, my table. In my restaurant, through the soft lighting, I could make out the letterhead of Will's law firm and what appeared to be property deeds and financial statements. They weren't just celebrating their affair, they were carving up my life like the Wagyu steak on Will's plate. The prenup is quite comprehensive, Greg was explaining to Sophia, his voice carrying just enough for me to catch fragments. She signed away rights to most marital assets, including any business ventures initiated during the marriage. Very forward-thinking of Will. Sophia leaned in, studying the documents with the intensity of someone examining a treasure map. What about the Beacon Hill townhouse, purchased before the marriage, solely in Will's name? She has no claim. My hands trembled as I reached for my champagne. The prenup. I remembered that day, 7 years ago, when Will had presented it to me just 3 weeks before our wedding. His father's lawyers had drafted it, he'd explained apologetically. Just a formality, really, but necessary given his family's real estate holdings and his political aspirations. I've been so in love, so trusting, that I barely read it before signing. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, except Eleanor's lawyer and my own carefully chosen financial advisors, was that I'd inherited my grandmother's fortune after our marriage. Every dollar I'd used to build the Sapphire was technically separate property, acquired through inheritance during the marriage and carefully protected through shell companies and trusts that Will had never discovered. The prenup that Will thought would leave me destitute actually couldn't touch the empire I'd built in secret. His lawyers had been so focused on protecting his assets that they'd inadvertently created the perfect legal framework to protect mine. She'll be lucky to qualify for alimony, Greg continued, clearly enjoying his role as the architect of my destruction. Given that she hasn't worked in years and has no marketable skills, the court will likely award minimal support, certainly not enough to maintain her current lifestyle. Will laughed, a sound that once brought me comfort and now felt like glass in my ears. Elizabeth always talked about opening a little cafe someday. Maybe this will finally force her to get realistic about her capabilities. Sophia's response made my blood freeze. A cafe? How quaint. I suppose everyone needs to have dreams, no matter how small. The condescension in her voice revealed something I'd been too naive to see. This wasn't a recent affair born of passion or circumstance. This had been calculated, methodical, a long-term strategy to replace me in every aspect of Will's life. Sophia had been studying me, learning my weaknesses, positioning herself as everything I wasn't: sophisticated where I was earthy, politically savvy where I was idealistic, ambitious where I was content. She'd been there for every private conversation about my insecurities, every moment of doubt about my marriage, every frustration with Will's increasing emotional distance. She'd encouraged me to confide in her, to trust her with my deepest fears about whether I was good enough for Will's world, and all along, she'd been using that information to perfect her own performance as my replacement. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about losing my husband to another woman. This was about losing myself to someone who had systematically studied and copied everything I was, then refined it into a version Will preferred. Sophia had become the woman I might have been if I'd been willing to completely abandon my own dreams and identity. But there was something they couldn't copy, couldn't steal, couldn't replicate: the strength I'd inherited from Eleanor Mitchell. My grandmother had built her fortune through sheer determination, working double shifts at a diner while secretly investing every spare dollar in real estate and municipal bonds. She taught me that true power came not from what people saw, but from what they never suspected. Power, she told me the day she gave me the safety deposit box key, is like the best seasoning, most effective when you can't taste it. But it transforms everything. Watching Will and his accomplices plan my destruction in my own restaurant, I finally understood what she meant. They thought they were the predators, and I was the prey. They had no idea they were performing their cruelty on my stage, surrounded by my people, completely at my mercy. The documents spread across their table represented Will's attempt to control a narrative that was already over. While he'd been planning to leave me with nothing, I'd been building something he couldn't even imagine. While he'd been teaching Sophia to replace me, I'd been becoming someone he'd never really known. The hurt was still there, sharp and immediate, but it was transforming into something more powerful. This wasn't just about exposing their betrayal anymore. This was about reclaiming not just my dignity, but my grandmother's legacy of quiet strength and strategic patience. I caught Diana's eye across the dining room and gave her the subtlest of nods. Phase 2 was about to begin. My phone buzzed with a text from my private investigator. Urgent: Sophia Miller has outstanding warrants. Need to meet immediately. I stepped away from my table, my heart racing as I processed this unexpected development. Robert appeared at my elbow, his expression grim. Chef, we have a situation developing in the main dining room. There's a woman at table 8 who's been watching the Wellington room entrance for the past 20 minutes. She looks distressed. I followed Robert back into the main restaurant, scanning the dining room until I spotted her. A petite brunette in her early 30s sat alone at table 8, her elegant black dress and pearl earrings suggesting wealth, but her body language screamed anxiety. She kept checking her phone, glancing toward the private dining room, and fidgeting with her wedding ring. As I approached her table, she looked up with eyes that were red-rimmed but determined. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Are you the manager? I need to speak with someone about a private matter. I'm Elizabeth Reynolds, the owner. How can I help you?" Her face went pale. "Reynolds, you're married to William Reynolds." "For now," I replied carefully, noting the way her hands trembled as she set down her wineglass. "I'm Amanda Palmer," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Greg's wife, and I think we need to talk." The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. This wasn't just about Will's affair or even his planned divorce strategy. Greg Palmer was conducting business that apparently his own wife knew nothing about, and her presence here couldn't be a coincidence. "Would you like to join me at a more private table?" I suggested, gesturing toward a quiet corner booth that would allow us to speak without being overheard. Amanda nodded gratefully, gathering her purse with shaking hands. As we settled into the booth, she pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages. "Greg told me he was working late tonight, reviewing briefs for a custody case, but I found these messages on his iPad this afternoon when I was trying to download a recipe." The texts were between Greg and someone identified only as W, clearly Will. The conversation revealed a level of personal investment in my destruction that went far beyond professional legal services. "Can't wait to see her face when she realizes she's getting nothing," read one message from Greg. "Sophia says Elizabeth actually thinks she could run a restaurant someday. The delusion is almost sad." Will had replied, "By the time we're done, she'll be lucky to afford a studio apartment in Dorchester. Then you and Sophia can start fresh without any financial complications." Amanda's voice was steady despite her obvious distress. "There are dozens of these messages going back months. Greg has been planning your destruction like it's some kind of personal vendetta. This isn't normal attorney-client communication." I studied Amanda's face, recognizing something familiar in her expression, the same hollow look I'd seen in my own mirror during the worst periods of my marriage. How long has he been treating you this way? What do you mean, the way you're sitting, the way you apologized before asking for help, the way you keep checking to make sure no one's watching us? I recognize the signs. Amanda's composure cracked slightly. 15 years. We met in law school, and he was brilliant, charming, going places. I supported him through the bar exam, through starting his practice, through building his reputation, and gradually, I became invisible. Except when he needed you to be visible? Exactly. The perfect attorney's wife for client dinners and bar association events, but never a partner, never an equal, just an accessory that could be put away when not needed. I pulled out my own phone and showed her some of the recordings from table 12. Your husband is in there right now, helping my husband and his mistress plan to leave me destitute. But what they don't know is that I'm not the helpless wife they think I am. Amanda listened to the audio with growing anger, her face transforming from defeated resignation to focused rage. Sophia Miller, she said suddenly. I know that name. Greg mentioned her months ago, said she was a potential client with immigration issues. What kind of immigration issues? That's just it. He was vague about the details, which isn't like Greg. He documents everything, keeps meticulous records. But when I asked about the Miller case, he said it was confidential and changed the subject. I thought about my private investigator's text about warrants. Amanda, what if I told you that Sophia might not be who she claims to be, and that your husband might be more involved in this than just providing legal services? She leaned forward, her earlier nervousness replaced by sharp focus. What do you mean, I mean? What if this isn't just about destroying my marriage for Will's political convenience? What if there's something else going on? Something that explains why Greg is so personally invested in making sure I end up with nothing? Amanda was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing implications I hadn't fully articulated yet. Greg has been working late more often, taking calls he says are confidential, traveling for client meetings that never appear on his official calendar. And the money. What about it? Has his income changed recently? New expenses, luxury purchases, anything that doesn't match his usual legal fees? Amanda's eyes widened as understanding dawned. The house in the Hamptons, he said it was a smart investment, that we could afford it because of a big settlement he'd just secured. But when I asked him about it, he said the details were subject to attorney-client privilege. We stared at each other across the table, both realizing that our husband's betrayal might be more complicated and more criminal than either of us had imagined. Amanda, I said carefully, how would you feel about helping me expose whatever this really is? Because I don't think either of us is going to find justice by suffering in silence. She straightened her shoulders, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked like the accomplished law school graduate she'd once been, rather than the diminished wife she'd become. What do you need me to do? My private investigator, Michael Chen, arrived at the Sapphire within 20 minutes of my urgent call. I'd known Michael for 3 years. He'd been instrumental in helping me establish the shell companies that protected my ownership of the restaurant. His discreet investigations had saved me from several bad business partnerships and one potentially disastrous real estate deal. This is bigger than adultery, Michael said without preamble as he slid into our corner booth, placing a thick manila envelope on the table. Sophia Miller doesn't exist. Amanda's sharp intake of breath was audible. What do you mean? I mean the woman your husbands are conspiring with is using a stolen identity? The real Sophia Miller died in a car accident in Phoenix 2 years ago, whoever this woman is. She's been living under a dead woman's name, complete with social security number, credit history, and educational credentials. I felt the blood drain from my face. But she was my maid of honor. I've known her for 8 years. Have you... Michael opened the envelope and spread out a series of photographs and documents. Because, according to these records, the woman calling herself Sophia Miller only appeared in Boston 3 years ago, which, coincidentally, is exactly when your marriage started showing signs of strain. The photographs were surveillance shots of Sophia, but also included images of documents, bank records, and what appeared to be multiple forms of identification. Michael pointed to a passport photo that showed Sophia's face but bore the name Victoria Santos. She's wanted by the FBI for identity theft, wire fraud, and running a marriage scam operation that targeted wealthy men in 3 different states. The pattern is always the same. She infiltrates their social circle through a female friend, builds trust over time, then systematically destroys the marriage while positioning herself as the perfect replacement. Amanda leaned forward, studying the documents. Greg knew. He had to have known. You can't conduct legal business with someone without verifying their identity. That's where it gets interesting. Michael continued, "Your husband isn't just Victoria's attorney, he's her partner. The Hamptons house you mentioned, it was purchased through a shell company that traces back to accounts in the Cayman Islands accounts that have been receiving regular deposits from 3 different men over the past 5 years. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This wasn't just about Will leaving me for another woman, it was about a sophisticated operation designed to systematically destroy wealthy marriages and steal assets through carefully orchestrated legal manipulation. She's done this before, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. Will isn't her first target. He's her third that we can verify, Michael confirmed. The pattern is always the same. She befriends the wife, gains intimate knowledge of the marriage's vulnerabilities, then begins a carefully timed affair while simultaneously feeding information to Greg Palmer, who positions himself as the husband's divorce attorney. But why Will? Amanda asked. If she's targeting wealth, there are richer men in the city. Michael smiled grimly. Because William Reynolds isn't just wealthy, he's politically ambitious, and political connections are worth more than money when you're running a long-term con. Think about the access she's gained through Will's campaign donor lists, insider information about real estate development projects, connections to judges and federal officials. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Victoria Sophia hadn't just stolen Will from me, she turned him into an unwitting accomplice in a criminal enterprise. Every donor meeting, every campaign event, every political connection had been an opportunity for intelligence gathering. The divorce isn't the end game, I realized aloud. It's the setup for whatever comes next. Exactly. Once Will marries Victoria, she'll have legitimate access to everything: his political network, his family's real estate empire, his campaign funds. And if he becomes a state senator, like he's planning, she'll have access to information that's worth millions to the right buyers. Amanda was studying Greg's text messages again, her expression growing more determined. These aren't just about your divorce. Look at this one from last week. She showed me a message from Greg to Will. Victoria's contact in the Planning Commission confirms the zoning change will be approved next month. We should finalize the purchase of the Seaport properties before the announcement. Insider trading, Michael said immediately. They're using Will's political connections to get advanced information about zoning changes, then investing in properties that will increase in value once the changes are announced. How much money are we talking about? I asked. Based on the property records I was able to access, they've already profited about $14 million from 4 different real estate deals over the past 18 months. And that's just what I could trace without a federal investigation. The restaurant around us continued its elegant dinner service, completely oblivious to the fact that we were unraveling a criminal conspiracy that stretched far beyond a simple marital betrayal. They're planning to destroy me financially, not just out of cruelty, I said slowly, but because they need me to be powerless. A bitter ex-wife with resources could expose their operation. Which is why the prenup was so important, Amanda added. Greg needed to ensure you'd have no money to hire investigators or lawyers who might discover the truth. Michael nodded. And Victoria needed to eliminate you completely from Will's life so you wouldn't be around to notice discrepancies in his income or ask questions about his new business ventures. I looked toward table 12, where my husband was currently planning my destruction with 2 criminals who had manipulated him so skillfully that he believed he was the mastermind. Michael, how much evidence do you have that would stand up in federal court? Enough to open an investigation, but we'd need more to guarantee convictions. Financial records, recorded conversations, documentation of the insider trading. I smiled for the first time all evening. What if I told you I had hours of recorded conversations from tonight, complete financial access to Will's accounts, and a very powerful motivation to see justice done? Amanda reached across the table and squeezed my hand. What if you had 2 very motivated women with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from exposing the truth? Michael's expression shifted from professional concern to predatory anticipation. Then I'd say Victoria Santos, or whoever she really is, picked the wrong targets this time. With Michael's revelation about the criminal conspiracy, our approach had to shift dramatically. This wasn't just about exposing an affair anymore. We were building a case that could send all 3 conspirators to federal prison for decades. We need to be surgical about this, Michael explained, pulling out a digital tablet and opening an encrypted app. One wrong move and they'll scatter like cockroaches. Victoria has already disappeared twice when investigations got too close in other states. Amanda was photographing Greg's text messages with a camera Michael had given her, one that would preserve metadata and timestamps that could be authenticated in court. How much time do we have? I asked. Based on their conversation at table 12, they're planning to accelerate the divorce proceedings, starting Monday morning, I said, checking my own recordings. Greg mentioned filing emergency motions to freeze assets and claim I'm mentally unstable. Classic pattern. Michael noted grimly. They'll paint you as an unfit wife who's become paranoid and delusional. Makes it easier to justify keeping you away from financial records that might expose their crimes. I thought about all the times Will had suggested I seemed stressed or not quite myself lately. Every missed social event. Every evening I'd claimed to be tired instead of attending his political functions. Every moment of distraction that was actually me building the Sapphire. It had all been carefully documented to support a narrative of mental decline. They've been building this case for months, I realized. Will has been setting me up to look unstable long before Victoria made her final move. Which means we have one advantage, Amanda said with growing confidence. They don't expect us to fight back. They think they're dealing with two broken, dependent wives. They have no idea what we're actually capable of. Michael smiled approvingly. Exactly. So here's what we're going to do. Amanda, I need you to go home and access Greg's home computer. He'll have backup files for everything lawyers are paranoid about data loss. Look for anything related to Sophia Miller, Victoria Santos, or the Cayman Island accounts. What if he's encrypted everything? He probably has, but men like Greg always keep a paper trail somewhere. Check his home office, especially any safety deposit box keys or offshore banking information. Also look for travel records if he's been making trips to the Cayman Islands or Phoenix. We need documentation. I pulled out my phone and accessed the Sapphire security system. I can give you real-time access to everything happening at Table 12. Michael, what specific evidence do we need for the federal charges? Wire fraud requires proof they used electronic communications to execute the scheme. We've got that in Greg's texts. Money laundering needs evidence of financial transactions designed to hide illegal profits. That's the Cayman accounts and the shell companies. The insider trading requires proof they used Will's political position to gain advance information for financial benefit. The recordings from tonight should cover the insider trading, I said, scrolling through the audio files. They've been discussing real estate purchases based on advanced knowledge of zoning changes. Perfect. But we also need to document the identity theft and marriage fraud. Victoria's been using stolen credentials to access bank accounts, secure credit, and establish legal residency. If we can prove she's committed these crimes while married to or engaged to multiple men simultaneously, we can add bigamy charges. Amanda was taking notes with the focused intensity of someone who'd remembered she used to be a lawyer. What about the assets they've already stolen? Can we recover the money they've taken from previous victims? If we can trace it, yes, federal asset forfeiture laws allow us to seize anything purchased with criminal proceeds. That Hampton's house, luxury cars, jewelry, investment accounts, all of it can be recovered and returned to victims. I thought about the sophisticated operation they'd built and the careful timing of tonight's dinner. They're planning something bigger than just my divorce. Michael, check Will's campaign schedule for the next month. I think they're positioning for a major score. Michael pulled up Will's public calendar on his tablet. He's got a fundraising dinner next week with major real estate developers, followed by a private meeting with the Planning Commission about the Seaport Development Project. That's a $3 billion development, I said, remembering Will's excitement about being included in those discussions. If Victoria can get advanced information about which properties will be rezoned for commercial use, she and Greg could make hundreds of millions in profits. And Will would be completely unaware he was facilitating the crime. Michael finished. The scope of what we were uncovering was staggering. Victoria hadn't just targeted Will for his wealth, she'd identified him as the perfect vehicle for accessing information that could generate massive illegal profits. His political ambitions and trusting nature made him the ideal unwitting accomplice. There's something else, Amanda said quietly. If Victoria is wanted by the FBI, why hasn't she been caught? How has she been able to operate under a stolen identity for years in Boston without detection? Michael's expression darkened. Because she's had help from someone with access to law enforcement databases, someone who could scrub records, delay investigations, and provide advanced warning about federal interest. Greg, I said with growing certainty. His law firm does white-collar criminal defense. He has contacts in the Justice Department, relationships with federal prosecutors, which means this conspiracy goes deeper than we thought. Michael confirmed. Greg isn't just Victoria's business partner. He's been actively protecting her from federal investigation while helping her target new victims. The full magnitude of what we were facing settled over our table like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about recovering stolen assets or exposing an affair we were taking on a criminal network that had been operating successfully for years with the protection of corrupt legal and political connections. Are we in over our heads? Amanda asked, voicing what we were all thinking. I looked around my restaurant, the empire I built in secret while being systematically undermined and dismissed. No, I said with quiet conviction. We're exactly where we need to be. They made one crucial mistake. What's that? They chose to destroy us in a place where I hold all the power, surrounded by people who are loyal to me, while documenting their crimes with recording equipment they don't know exists. Tonight, they're going to hand us everything we need to destroy them. While Michael briefed Amanda on evidence collection techniques, I excused myself to make the most important phone call of my life. My hands were steady as I dialed the direct number for FBI Special Agent Sarah Johnson, whom I'd met 2 years ago when she'd investigated money laundering at a competing restaurant. She'd given me her card, half joking that if I ever encountered financial crimes in the hospitality industry, I should call her directly. Agent Johnson, this is Elizabeth Reynolds from the Sapphire. I have a situation that requires immediate federal attention. Mrs. Reynolds, it's nearly midnight. What kind of situation? Wire fraud, money laundering, insider trading, and identity theft currently happening in my restaurant. I have recorded evidence and live surveillance of the perpetrators planning their next crimes. There was a pause. How certain are you about this? Certain enough to risk my marriage, my reputation, and my safety to expose it. 2. Agent Johnson, I need you to understand this isn't a domestic dispute that's gotten out of hand. This is a sophisticated criminal operation that's been running for years. I'm listening. I gave her a rapid but comprehensive overview of what Michael had discovered, the evidence we'd gathered, and the crimes being planned at Table 12. Agent Johnson asked sharp, specific questions that told me she was taking this seriously. Mrs. Reynolds, I need you to maintain normal behavior until my team arrives. Do not confront the subjects, do not alter their environment, and do not give them any reason to suspect they're under surveillance. Can you do that? Yes. How long do you need? 20 minutes for a tactical team, 45 for a full investigation unit. The evidence you're describing could break open a case we've been building for 2 years. After ending the call, I returned to our corner table, where Michael was showing Amanda how to use a covert recording device. The contrast between our quiet preparation and the oblivious celebration happening 30 feet away at Table 12 was almost surreal. Federal agents are en route, I reported. We have 45 minutes to finalize everything. Michael nodded approvingly. Amanda, you need to leave now and access Greg's files. The FBI will want to coordinate a simultaneous search of his office and home. Can you get us inside legally? I'm his wife. I have keys to everything, Amanda said with new determination. And as of tonight, I'm also a cooperating witness in a federal investigation. After Amanda left, Michael and I reviewed our evidence one final time. The recordings from Table 12 contain clear discussions of insider trading, money laundering through shell companies, and plans to accelerate my financial destruction before any investigation could begin. The documentation about Victoria's stolen identity and Greg's role in protecting her created a compelling case for conspiracy charges. There's one more thing we need to consider, Michael said quietly. Will isn't just a victim in this. His political career is over, even if he was manipulated. The optics of being involved with a wanted criminal will destroy any future he'd planned. I felt a complex mix of emotions about Will's impending downfall. Part of me still remembered the idealistic young politician. I'd fallen in love with the man who genuinely wanted to improve his community. But that man had been replaced by someone willing to destroy me for his own advancement. Someone who'd chosen cruelty over compassion when it served his purposes. He made his choices, I said finally. I'm not responsible for protecting him from the consequences. Through the restaurant's main windows, I could see unmarked federal vehicles beginning to position themselves around the building. Agent Johnson was coordinating an operation that would simultaneously arrest the conspirators while preserving all evidence. The FBI had been tracking Victoria for 2 years without success. Tonight would be their chance to end her criminal career permanently. Diana appeared at my table, her expression carefully neutral despite the unusual activity she'd undoubtedly noticed. Chef, the guests at Table 12 have requested their check. Should I prepare it normally? I almost laughed at the absurd irony. After hours of planning my destruction, Will was ready to pay for the privilege, using what he assumed was our joint credit card. Yes, but make sure they understand that payment is required before leaving. No exceptions. As Diana walked away, I realized this might be the last normal moment I'd have for a very long time. Once the arrest began, my life would become a whirlwind of federal investigations, media attention, and legal proceedings. The quiet empire I'd built in secret would be exposed to public scrutiny, but I wasn't afraid anymore. The woman who'd spent 7 years shrinking herself to fit Will's vision of the perfect political wife was gone. In her place was someone who'd learned to build power in silence, who'd mastered the art of strategic patience, who'd inherited the strength of women who'd survived by being underestimated. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Johnson. Team in position. Maintain normal operations until my signal. I stood up and smoothed my dress, checking my reflection one final time in the mirror behind our booth. In 5 minutes. I was going to walk into that private dining room and watch my husband's carefully constructed world collapse around him. But first, I had one more call to make. Mark, it's time to serve dessert to table 12. Make sure it's absolutely perfect. It's going to be their last meal as free people. I walked toward table 12 with the measured pace of someone who had all the time in the world. My heels clicked against the marble floor in perfect rhythm, each step carrying me closer to a confrontation that would end one life and begin another. The dining room around me continued its elegant dance of service and conversation, completely unaware that they were about to witness the conclusion of a federal investigation. Through the partially open door of the private dining room, I could hear Will's voice rising with excitement as he described his vision for the future. Once the divorce is finalized and I marry Sophia, we'll have the perfect political partnership. She understands strategy in ways Elizabeth never could. To new beginnings, Sophia Victoria's voice chimed in, followed by the clink of champagne glasses. I paused at the threshold, taking in the scene before me. Will sat at the head of the mahogany table, his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened. With the casual confidence of a man who believed he controlled everything around him, Victoria was positioned to his right, her red dress and auburn hair catching the warm light from the crystal chandelier I personally selected for this room. Greg occupied the seat across from her, surrounded by legal documents and financial statements that represented their plan to destroy my life. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were conducting this celebration in a room I owned, drinking wine I'd chosen, planning to steal assets I'd accumulated while building the very empire that surrounded them. Well, I said, stepping into the room with a smile that felt sharp as a blade. This looks like quite the celebration. Will's head snapped up, his expression shifting from surprise to annoyance to barely concealed anger in the space of 2 seconds. Elizabeth, what are you doing here? Having dinner at my favorite restaurant, I replied smoothly, allowing my gaze to sweep across the documents scattered on the table. Though it looks like you've been conducting business rather than enjoying your meal, how very like you. Victoria's laugh was too bright, too forced. Will mentioned you've been struggling lately. It's so brave of you to come out tonight instead of staying home. The casual cruelty of the comment, the implication that I was somehow fragile or unstable, revealed everything I needed to know about how they'd been framing my behavior. Every missed political event, every evening I'd claimed exhaustion, every moment I'd seemed distracted had been carefully cataloged to support their narrative of my mental decline. Struggling, I repeated, genuinely curious about their interpretation. That's an interesting way to describe building something extraordinary while everyone around you assumes you're doing nothing at all. Greg cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with my unexpected presence. Perhaps we should continue this discussion at another time. This is a private dining room. Yes, I agreed pleasantly. It is, which is why I'm curious about why you're here at all. Mr. Palmer, I wasn't aware that Will had any legal matters requiring immediate attention on our anniversary. The three of them exchanged glances that confirmed they hadn't expected to be questioned about their presence together. In their planning, they'd assumed I would be home devastated and isolated, probably crying into a bottle of wine while they celebrated their victory. Greg is helping me with some routine legal matters, Will said dismissively. Nothing that concerns you. Routine legal matters involving Sophia. How thoughtful of you to include her in such discussions. Sophia is my campaign manager, Will replied with the rehearsed tone of someone who'd practiced this explanation. She has a legitimate interest in ensuring that my personal affairs don't create complications for the campaign. I nodded, as if this made perfect sense, all while noting the defensive positions they'd unconsciously assumed. Will had straightened in his chair, putting distance between himself and the incriminating documents. Victoria had shifted slightly away from the table, as if preparing to leave quickly if necessary. Greg had begun gathering papers with the nervous efficiency of someone who didn't want his materials examined too closely. Of course, I said. I imagine campaign management requires quite a lot of personal involvement these days. The tension in the room was palpable as I moved closer to the table, my eyes scanning the documents they'd tried to conceal. Financial statements, property deeds, and what appeared to be campaign finance records were spread across the mahogany surface like evidence in a criminal investigation. You know what's fascinating about campaign management? I continued conversationally, picking up one of the papers before Will could stop me. The level of financial oversight required, all those donor contributions, expense reports, compliance documents. Put that down, Will said sharply, his political composure finally cracking. That's confidential campaign business. Is it, I studied the document in my hands, a property acquisition form for a building in the Seaport District that was dated next month but signed yesterday. Because this looks more like real estate speculation based on insider information about zoning changes. The color drained from Greg's face. You don't understand what you're looking at. Don't I? I set the paper down and picked up another one this time. A bank statement showing wire transfers to an account in the Cayman Islands, because I'm looking at what appears to be money laundering through offshore accounts. And this, I held up a third document, looks like a false identity application for someone named Victoria Santos. Victoria's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a spray of crystal and wine. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence as all three of them realized their carefully guarded secrets were scattered across the table for anyone to see. Who exactly are you, Sophia? I asked quietly. Because Sophia Miller died in a car accident in Phoenix 2 years ago. You're talking nonsense, Will blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. Sophia, tell her she's wrong. For the first time since I'd known her, Victoria had nothing to say. The confident, polished woman who had systematically stolen my life was staring at me with something approaching terror. The FBI has been looking for Victoria Santos for quite some time, I continued, noting how she flinched at the name. Wire fraud, identity theft, marriage fraud across multiple states. Quite an impressive criminal resume. Greg was frantically gathering papers, his hands shaking as he tried to stuff incriminating evidence back into his briefcase. This is absurd. These are legitimate business documents. Are they because Special Agent Sarah Johnson of the FBI seems to think otherwise? She's been investigating this operation for 2 years. The mention of an active federal investigation sent all three of them into a panic. Will shot to his feet, his chair toppling backward with a crash that echoed through the private dining room. You're bluffing, he said, but I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. There's no investigation. You're just trying to cause trouble because you're upset about the divorce. Am I? I smiled and pulled out my phone, showing them the active call to Agent Johnson. Would you like to ask her yourself? The door to the private dining room opened with perfect timing as Agent Johnson entered, followed by 4 FBI agents in tactical gear. The sight of federal law enforcement officers caused Victoria to bolt for the rear exit, but she found her path blocked by 2 more agents who had anticipated her escape route. Victoria Santos, Agent Johnson said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been hunting this criminal for years. You're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit federal crimes. Will stood frozen in the center of the room, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror as he realized the woman he planned to marry was a wanted federal criminal. William Reynolds and Gregory Palmer. Agent Johnson continued, You're also under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda rights filled the air, I watched 7 years of marriage and manipulation crumble into handcuffs and federal charges. Will's political career was over, Victoria's criminal enterprise was finished, and Greg's corrupt legal practice was about to face federal scrutiny that would destroy everything he'd built. The only sound in the room was the click of handcuffs and the quiet weeping of 3 people who had finally met consequences they couldn't charm, manipulate, or lawyer their way out of. As the FBI agents escorted Will, Victoria, and Greg out of the private dining room in handcuffs, I remained standing beside the mahogany table where their criminal conspiracy had been laid bare. The scattered documents that had once represented my destruction now served as evidence that would send them to federal prison for decades. Will turned back to look at me one final time as Agent Johnson guided him toward the door, his face a mask of disbelief and something that might have been betrayal, as if I had somehow wronged him by exposing his crimes. Elizabeth, he said, his voice carrying a note of desperate confusion. You don't understand what you've done. My career, my future, you've destroyed everything. I looked at the man I'd been married to for 7 years, this stranger who had systematically dismantled my identity while planning to steal everything I'd built. The hurt was still there, sharp and immediate, but it was overshadowed by something more powerful, absolute clarity about who he really was. No, Will, I replied quietly, my voice carrying across the elegant dining room where we'd celebrated what he'd intended to be the end of our marriage. You destroyed everything. I just made sure there were consequences. Agent Johnson paused in the doorway, allowing Will one last moment to speak. Perhaps she understood that some conversations needed to happen, even between criminals and their victims. You never could have afforded a place like this, Will said with a bitter laugh that contained no humor. You never could have built anything without me. After the divorce, you'll have nothing. The irony was so perfect, so complete, that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I walked to the head of the table where Will had been sitting just minutes before, my hand resting on the mahogany surface that he'd used as a desk for planning my destruction. Around us, the elegant private dining room reflected the warm light of crystal chandeliers. Italian marble gleamed under soft lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Boston Harbor. "Will," I said, my voice steady and clear, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Meet my staff." I gestured toward Diana, who stood in the doorway with the dignity of someone who'd served the most powerful people in Boston for 3 years, toward Robert, whose impeccable management had made the Sapphire the most sought-after reservation in the city, toward Mark, whose culinary genius had earned us reviews that established restaurants would kill for. "This is my restaurant. I own it. I built it. Every marble tile, every crystal chandelier, every perfectly prepared dish that you've been enjoying tonight represents my vision, my investment, my success." Will's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a dawning horror as he realized the full scope of what he'd never known about his wife. "The prenup you're so proud of," I continued, pulling out my phone to show him the shell company documentation that Michael had prepared years ago. "It protects your assets from me, not mine from you. Everything I inherited from my grandmother, everything I built during our marriage, everything you assumed didn't exist, it's all mine. Completely, legally, permanently mine." The federal agents waited patiently as Will processed the magnitude of his miscalculation. He'd planned to destroy a helpless, dependent wife and instead had attacked a successful businesswoman with resources he couldn't imagine and connections he'd never suspected. "Oh, and darling," I said, borrowing his condescending tone and turning it back on him with perfect precision. "Get out of my restaurant." Agent Johnson nodded approvingly and guided Will toward the exit. As they reached the door, I heard him ask in a broken voice, "How long have you known?" "About the restaurant, 3 years. About Victoria being a criminal tonight." I paused, considering the question honestly. "About you being capable of this level of cruelty? I think I've known that for longer than I was willing to admit." The door closed behind them with a soft click of finality, leaving me alone in the private dining room where my marriage had officially ended and my real life had finally begun. 6 months later, I stood in the same private dining room where everything had changed, but this time I wasn't alone. Amanda Palmer sat across from me, her transformation as dramatic as my own. The broken, diminished woman who had approached my table that night was gone, replaced by someone who carried herself with the confidence of a federal witness whose testimony had helped dismantle a criminal enterprise. "The sentencing hearing is next week," she said, closing her laptop after reviewing the final witness statements. "Greg's looking at 15 to 20 years. Victoria Santos got 25 to life as a repeat offender. And Will, 12 years," I finished, feeling nothing but quiet satisfaction. "Plus forfeiture of all assets purchased with criminal proceeds." The federal investigation had unraveled a conspiracy that stretched back 8 years and involved 17 victims across 5 states. Victoria's marriage fraud operation had stolen over $40 million from wealthy men who had trusted her with their hearts and their fortunes. Greg's corrupt legal practice had enabled every theft, every identity change, every strategic divorce that left victims financially and emotionally destroyed. Will's political career had ended the night of his arrest, but his legal troubles were just beginning. The insider trading charges alone carried a 10-year sentence, and his cooperation with the federal investigation had only reduced his time marginally. The man who had once dreamed of becoming a state senator was now preparing for more than a decade in federal prison. "Have you heard from him?" Amanda asked gently. She'd become more than an ally in our fight for justice. She'd become the closest friend I'd had since Victoria's betrayal. "His lawyer called last week requesting a meeting. Something about wanting to apologize before sentencing." I shook my head, still amazed by Will's inability to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. I declined. Some conversations don't need to happen. Through the windows of the private dining room, Boston Harbor stretched out in the golden light of late afternoon. The Sapphire had not only survived the media attention from the federal case, it had thrived. Being the restaurant where a major FBI operation concluded had only added to our mystique. Reservations were booked solid for 8 months, and 3 major food magazines had featured us on their covers. But the real victory wasn't professional success, it was personal. I'd reclaimed not just my dignity and my assets, but my sense of self. The woman who had spent 7 years shrinking to fit someone else's vision was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to apologize for it. "What's next for you?" Amanda asked, gathering her papers as our meeting concluded. I smiled, thinking about the culinary school I was planning to open, the cookbook deal I'd just signed, and the speech I'd been invited to give at the Women's Business Leadership Conference next month. Everything we'll never thought I was capable of, I said. And then some. As Amanda left for her own New Life Law School at 42, determined to become the prosecutor she'd always dreamed of being, I remained in the private dining room for a few more minutes. This space had witnessed the end of one life and the beginning of another. It had been the stage for the most spectacular revenge story in recent Boston history. But more than that, it had been the place where I finally learned that the most powerful thing you can do to someone who has underestimated you is simply to succeed beyond their wildest imagination. The house always wins, especially when you own the house. 1 year to the day after the arrests, I hosted a private dinner party in the Wellington Room, the same space where Will, Victoria, and Greg had planned my destruction. But tonight, the room had been transformed, just as I had been. The guest list was carefully curated, the victims of Victoria's previous scams, the women who had been left broken and impoverished by her scheme. They had come from Chicago, San Francisco, Phoenix, drawn together by a shared experience none of us had asked for, but all of us had survived. Jennifer Caldwell, 56, had lost her 30-year marriage and most of her family's fortune to Victoria's first known con. She sat at my right, her silver hair elegantly styled, her designer outfit a statement of reclaimed dignity. The legal team I'd assembled had helped her recover $8.2 million of her stolen assets. I never thought I'd laugh again, she told me, raising her glass. But here we are. Across from her sat Rebecca Martinez, 48, whose husband had committed suicide after discovering Victoria's deception and the financial ruin she'd left in her wake. Rebecca's path to healing had been the most difficult, but the foundation we'd established for victims of marriage fraud had provided her with both financial support and purpose. He would have wanted me to rebuild, she said quietly, to find joy again. Margaret Wilson, 62, had been a federal judge before Victoria targeted her son, using him to gain access to sensitive legal information that she sold to criminal organizations. Margaret had lost her position on the bench during the scandal, but our legal team had cleared her name. She was now heading up the legal division of our foundation. Ladies, I said, rising to offer a toast as Mark's perfectly crafted dessert course was served. 1 year ago, I thought my life was ending. I had been betrayed by my husband, my best friend, and a system that was supposed to protect people like us. The women nodded, each recognizing her own story in my words. But what Victoria and her accomplices never understood was that we are not defined by the men who betrayed us or the pain they caused. We are defined by how we choose to rebuild. I gestured around the elegant dining room, to the crystal chandeliers that caught and reflected light like diamonds, to the immaculate service that had made the sapphire famous, to the women who had refused to be victims. Look at what we've accomplished in just 1 year. 4 of Victoria's victims have recovered over $22 million in stolen assets. Our foundation has provided legal support to 36 women who were targeted by similar schemes, and 3 state legislatures are now considering laws we helped draft to strengthen protections against marriage fraud. Jennifer raised her glass higher. To Elizabeth, who taught us that revenge isn't about destroying your enemies, it's about building something so magnificent they can see it from their prison cells. The laughter that followed was genuine, healing, and perhaps the sweetest sound I'd ever heard in this room. These women who had once been broken, just as I had been, were now powerful, purposeful, and determined to ensure that what happened to us would never happen to anyone else. As dinner concluded and my guests moved to the main dining room for coffee, I took a moment alone with the latest letter from Eleanor's safety deposit box, one I hadn't discovered until after Will's arrest. My grandmother, with her uncanny foresight, had left instructions for me to open it when the storm has passed. My dearest Elizabeth, she'd written in her precise hand, if you're reading this, then you faced betrayal and come out stronger. I always knew you would. What I never told you is that your grandfather didn't die of a heart attack as everyone believes. Thomas Mitchell was a con man who married me for my family's modest wealth, then tried to destroy me when he discovered I was smarter than he gave me credit for. The revelation stunned me. I'd grown up believing my grandfather was a hard-working man who had died too young, leaving Eleanor to raise my mother alone. When he realized I had been secretly investing and building my own fortune, he tried to have me declared mentally unstable, a common tactic for men of his generation. What he didn't know was that I had been documenting his affairs and financial misconduct for years. The night before, he planned to have me committed. I presented my evidence to his business partners. He left Boston the next day and never returned. The heart attack story was kinder for your mother than the truth. I sat down heavily in the chair Will had occupied a year ago, understanding for the first time why Eleanor had been so insistent that I protect myself, why she'd taught me to build power in silence, why she'd left me not just her money, but her strategy for surviving in a world where women were still too often seen as accessories rather than equals. The Mitchell women have a legacy of strength that no man has ever fully understood. Her letter concluded, "We appear to bend, but we never break. We seem to yield, but we are actually gathering force, and when we finally reveal ourselves, we are unstoppable." I carefully folded the letter and returned it to my purse, understanding now that my story had begun long before I met Will, the journey that had led me to this moment owning one of Boston's most successful restaurants, heading a foundation that helped women reclaim their lives, building a network of powerful allies who valued me for my mind rather than my appearance, had its roots in generations of women who had refused to be diminished. I rejoined my guests in the main dining room, where Diana was conducting an impromptu wine tasting. The Sapphire was closed to the public tonight, transformed into a sanctuary for women who had been through the fire and emerged stronger. "You know what's interesting about fine wine?" Diana was explaining as I approached. "It doesn't actually get better with age, it gets more authentic. The characteristics that were always there become more pronounced, more defined. The same is true of people." "I'll drink to that," Margaret said, raising her glass, "to becoming more ourselves." As the evening progressed, I found myself standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Boston Harbor, watching the lights of the city reflect off the water. 1 year ago, I had stood in almost this exact spot, watching my husband arrive with the woman who had plotted my destruction. Now I stood surrounded by women who had survived similar betrayals, each of us rebuilding our lives on our own terms. We had transformed trauma into purpose, humiliation into power, betrayal into connection. The irony wasn't lost on me that Will, Victoria, and Greg had intended the Sapphire to be the scene of my greatest humiliation. Instead, it had become the birthplace of my most authentic self and the headquarters of a movement that was changing laws and lives across the country. Jennifer joined me at the window, her reflection appearing beside mine in the darkened glass. "Do you ever wonder what they think about, sitting in their cells?" she asked. "Do you think they understand what they created when they tried to destroy us?" I considered the question, thinking about the letter from Eleanor and the legacy she had passed to me. I don't think men like Will and Greg are capable of that kind of self-reflection. They still believe they were the masterminds, that they were in control. They don't understand that they were just another chapter in a much longer story. "Victoria understands," Jennifer said with quiet certainty. "Women always do. That's why her sentence was the longest. She betrayed her own kind. There's no coming back from that." I nodded, thinking about the former best friend who had studied me for years, learning my vulnerabilities in order to replace me. Victoria had understood exactly what she was doing, which made her betrayal the most unforgivable. "You know what I wish I could tell them all," I said, watching a sailboat glide across the harbor. "That the moment they thought was my lowest point was actually the beginning of my freedom. Every awful thing they did only served to make me stronger, more determined, more myself." Jennifer smiled, the lines around her eyes crinkling with hard-won wisdom. "That's the thing about underestimating women like us, isn't it? They never see us coming until it's too late." As the evening drew to a close and I bid farewell to my guests, promising to reconvene in 6 months for our foundation's first official gala, I found myself alone in the Sapphire for the first time in weeks. The restaurant that had once been my secret refuge had become a very public symbol of female resilience and business acumen. I walked through the silent dining room, trailing my fingers along the backs of chairs where Boston's elite came to be seen, to make deals, to celebrate milestones. Every corner of this space reflected choices I had made, tastes I had developed, standards I had set. For 7 years, Will had convinced me that my dreams were small, my ambitions quaint, my capabilities limited. He had drawn an ever-shrinking circle around me and called it protection. He had dismantled my confidence piece by piece and called it guidance. And all the while, I had been building something extraordinary right under his nose, something that now employed 50 people, served thousands of guests each month, and had become a landmark in Boston's culinary landscape. I ended my solitary tour in the kitchen, the heart of the restaurant, and the place I felt most at home. Tomorrow morning, a film crew would arrive to begin shooting my new cooking show, Hidden Ingredients, where I would teach viewers to recognize the potential in overlooked elements, to build flavor through patience and technique, to create dishes that revealed themselves slowly but left a lasting impression. The show was part of a 3-book deal I'd signed with a major publisher, focusing on the art of strategic cooking dishes that appeared simple but contained complex, unexpected elements that transformed the entire experience. It was, I realized, the perfect metaphor for the life I was now living. From the outside, I appeared to be a successful restaurateur who had survived a public scandal. But beneath that visible success was a carefully constructed network of powerful women, legal resources, and financial strategies designed to change the systems that had almost destroyed us. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael Chen, final victim located, Helen Porter, San Diego, Victoria's earliest known target. Ready when you are. I smiled, thinking about the next phase of our work. We had already helped 4 of Victoria's victims recover their stolen assets and rebuild their lives. Now we had found the 5th and likely the first woman who had fallen prey to the same scheme that had almost destroyed me. I typed a quick response. Book my flight. Time to welcome another member to the family. The woman Will had married the soft-spoken, accommodating political wife who measured her words and diminished her dreams to avoid causing ripples, would never have flown across the country to help a stranger fight a legal battle against powerful men. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I was Elizabeth Reynolds, owner of the Sapphire, founder of the Phoenix Foundation for Victims of Financial Fraud, and living proof that the most dangerous thing you can do to a woman is underestimate her. Eleanor Mitchell's granddaughter had finally come into her own, carrying forward a legacy of quiet strength, strategic patience, and the absolute certainty that the house always wins, especially when you own the house. When the Boston Globe published their feature on me 5 years after the arrests, the headline read, From Political Wife to Culinary Empire, How Elizabeth Reynolds Built a Dynasty from Betrayal. The article detailed the now infamous night when my husband brought his girlfriend to our anniversary dinner, not knowing the restaurant was mine. It chronicled the federal investigation that had uncovered one of the most sophisticated marriage fraud operations in recent history. It praised the work of the Phoenix Foundation, which had now helped over 200 women recover from financial exploitation and changed laws in 12 states. What the article couldn't capture was the moment I realized I was free, truly free from the weight of others' expectations. It couldn't describe how it felt to reclaim not just my financial security, but my sense of self. It couldn't articulate the profound satisfaction of creating a community of women who had transformed victimhood into power. As I prepared for the grand opening of my 3rd restaurant, a more casual concept called Eleanor's that would make fine dining accessible to a broader audience, I thought about the circle of events that had brought me here. If Will had never betrayed me, if Victoria had never targeted me, if Greg had never plotted against me, I might still be playing the role of the supportive political wife. My dreams deferred indefinitely, my potential unrealized, their cruelty, designed to destroy me, had instead been the catalyst for my reinvention. Their underestimation of me had created the space for me to become someone they couldn't have imagined. Their conspiracy, meant to leave me with nothing, had given me everything I truly needed: clarity, purpose, and the unshakable confidence that comes from rebuilding your life on your own terms. The night of the grand opening, as I stood addressing the crowd of guests, investors, and media, I caught sight of Amanda Palmer at a corner table. Now a federal prosecutor specializing in financial crimes against women. She had become both a close friend and a powerful ally in our work. Beside her sat Michael Chen, whose investigation firm now trained law enforcement across the country on identifying and prosecuting marriage fraud schemes. The women of Victoria's other scams were there too: Jennifer, Rebecca, Margaret, and Helen, each of them now successful in reclaimed or entirely new careers. Each of them a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. 5 years ago, I told the gathered crowd, I discovered that my husband was planning to leave me with nothing. Tonight, I'm opening my 3rd restaurant, celebrating the 5th anniversary of our foundation, and announcing a new scholarship program for women re-entering the workforce after financial trauma. The applause was thunderous, but I raised my hand for quiet. What I want you to understand is that this isn't a story about revenge. It's not even a story about justice, though justice was certainly served. I paused, looking around at the faces of people who had supported me, believed in me, and helped me build something meaningful from the ashes of betrayal. This is a story about recognizing your own worth when others have tried to diminish it, recognizing your own power when others have tried to take it from you, recognizing that sometimes the people who hurt us most deeply are actually setting us free. I raised my glass, and 200 people stood to join me in the toast. To unexpected blessings, to second acts, and to the infinite possibilities that emerge when you finally become the person you were always meant to be. As the evening progressed and Eleanor's welcomed its first official guests, I found myself standing once again by a window overlooking the city. Boston had been the backdrop for both my greatest humiliation and my most spectacular triumph. Its skyline had witnessed my transformation from political accessory to business leader, from betrayed wife to architect of my own destiny. Amanda joined me, champagne in hand. Penny for your thoughts. I smiled at the friend who had walked through fire with me and emerged just as transformed. I was just thinking about Will. His parole hearing is next month. Are you going to attend? I shook my head. There's nothing left to say. He's served his time, and I've built my life. We're both exactly where our choices have led us. Amanda nodded, understanding without further explanation. The women in San Francisco want you to speak at their fundraiser next month. They're starting a Phoenix Foundation chapter there. Book it, I said without hesitation. And let's see if we can get the governor to attend. It's time to push for the legislative package. This was my life now running restaurants, expanding the foundation, changing laws to protect vulnerable women, mentoring young female entrepreneurs. Each day was filled with purpose, challenge, and the deep satisfaction of living authentically. The 20-something line cook who had once believed she needed a man's approval to pursue her dreams had become a 50-something business owner who measured success by her own standards. The woman who had shrunk herself to fit into someone else's life had expanded to create a life big enough to include hundreds of other women on similar journeys. As Eleanor's hummed with the energy of a successful opening night, I thought about my grandmother's letter and the generations of Mitchell women who had survived by being underestimated. I thought about the quiet strength it takes to build something in secret, the strategic patience required to wait for the perfect moment, the courage needed to reveal yourself fully when that moment arrives. I had learned the most valuable lesson of all true power isn't about controlling others, it's about becoming so completely yourself that no one else can define you, diminish you, or determine your worth. The house always wins, especially when you've built it yourself, brick by brick, from the foundation up, and I was just getting started.